Okay, I have a question just regarding how we're going to go about it.
Sure.
So, the argument I favor takes the form of an academic paper, and for me to like present it all in full would take kind of a while.
Mhm.
Um, but there's also um, there's a conference at which the author presented the piece. Um, and I personally think it's both entertaining and edifying to listen to him give the paper rather than, and it would probably be more so than to just have me try to give a condensed version of it. So, are, what do we think about like? Are there bots that can play audio, or should I just try to
Well,
condense
I
it?
think honestly that you should try and sum it up. If you would want at a later date to make a debate proposition based off of that video, we should at least give people time to watch it.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay,
So I'm
so I
okay
mean,
with either way you want to go about that. If you want to postpone it to later, or if you want to try
no.
and give a summarization, that's either is fine by me.
So what I think I'll do is I'll give so it's based on a thought experiment. So I think I'll just read his treatment of the thought experiment, and then I won't, go into the long detailed series of potential objections and replies that he gives. And if you want to level those at me, then I'll respond to them on my own.
Okay.
Um, does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good. Go ahead.
Okay. So have you heard of the paper? It's called Puppies, Pigs, and People Eating Meat
No.
in Marginal Cases.
Eating meat in marginal cases. Okay, well, I mean, I'm definitely familiar with marginal cases, but I don't know the paper specifically.
Right. So it's a specific argument, I think, intended to appeal specifically to people in, I guess you could say, like the West, but I think specifically Americans because of how much we seem to love dogs. I don't know if people love dogs as much in any other country. Um,
Uh-huh.
but so I mean, the reason that I find this especially convincing, I mean, I was already vegan when I came across this paper, but I found that it struck um, certain emotional resonances with me, and the people I've shown it to have, um, you know, admittedly, it's not more than like 10 uh, people, like some family members, some friends, and my girlfriend.
No, don't.
And
I'm not worried about like a big statistical analysis that we can't
right,
possibly do. Just give the case that you think is convincing, and we'll just have a conversation about it.
got you. Just that, like, they've never responded with objections. It's always been, but they haven't necessarily gone vegan. They've been basically like, I accept that I ought to go vegan, but I'm
Yeah,
weak.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I,
So
I definitely understand that position where somebody's just like, oof, right in the feels. I'm not willing to do it yet, but I feel like I'm motivated
I'm
to.
convinced. Right, right,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so here is the paper. So let's see. The thought experiment runs for page and a half. Okay, so consider the story of Fred, who receives a visit from the police one day. They've been summoned by Fred's neighbors, who have been disturbed by strange sounds emanating from Fred's basement. When they enter the basement, they are confronted by the following scene: 26 small wire cages, each containing a puppy, some whining, some whimpering, some howling. The puppies range in age from newborn to about 6 months. Many of them show signs of mutilation. Urine and feces cover the bottoms of the cages and the basement floor. Fred explains that he keeps the puppies for 26 weeks and then butchers them while holding them upside down. During their lives, he performs a series of mutilations on them, such as slicing off their noses and their paws with a hot knife, all without any form of anesthesia. Except for the mutilations, the puppies are never allowed out of the cages, which are barely big enough to hold them at 26 weeks. The police are horrified and promptly charge Fred with animal abuse. As details of the case are publicized, the public is outraged. Newspapers are flooded with letters demanding that Fred be severely punished. There are calls for more severe penalties for animal abuse. Fred is denounced as a vile sadist. Finally, at his trial, Fred explains his behavior and argues that he is blameless and therefore deserves no punishment. He is, he explains, a great lover of chocolate. A couple of years ago, he was involved in a car accident which resulted in some head trauma. Upon his release from hospital, having apparently suffered no lasting ill effects, he visited his favorite restaurant and ordered their famous rich dark chocolate mousse. Imagine his dismay when he discovered that his experience of the mousse was a pale shadow of its former self. The mousse tasted bland, slightly pleasant, but with none of the intense chocolatey flavor he remembered so well. The waiter assured him that the recipe was unchanged from the last time he had tasted it, just a day before his accident. In some consternation, Fred rushed out to buy a bar of his favorite Belgian chocolate. Again, he was dismayed to discover that his experience of the chocolate was barely even pleasurable. Extensive investigation revealed that his experience of other foods remained unaffected, but chocolate, in all its forms, now tasted bland and insipid. Desperate for a solution to his problem, Fred visited a renowned gustatory neurologist, Dr. T. Budd. Extensive tests revealed that the accident had irreparably damaged the Godiva gland, which secretes cocoamone, the hormone responsible for the experience of chocolate. Fred urgently requested hormone replacement therapy. Dr. Budd informed him that until recently there had been no known source of cocoamone other than the human Godiva gland, and that it was impossible to collect cocoamone from one person to be used by another. However, a chance discovery had altered the situation. A forensic veterinary surgeon performing an autopsy on a severely abused puppy had discovered high concentrations of cocoamone in the puppy's brain. It turned out that puppies, who don't normally produce cocoamone, could be stimulated to do so by extended periods of severe stress and suffering. The research, which led to this discovery, while gaining tenure for its authors, had not been widely publicized for fear of antagonizing animal welfare groups. Although this research clearly gave Fred the hope of tasting chocolate again, there were no commercially available sources of puppy derived cocoamone. Lack of demand combined with fear of bad publicity had deterred drug companies from getting into the puppy torturing business. Fred appeals to the court to imagine his anguish on discovering that a solution to his severe deprivation was possible but not readily available. But he wasn't inclined to sit around bemoaning his cruel fate. He did what any chocolate lover would do. He read the research and set up his own cocoamone collection lab in his basement. 6 months of intense puppy suffering, followed by a brutal death, produced enough cocoamone to last him a week, hence the 26 cages. He isn't a sadist or an animal abuser, he explains. If there were a method of collecting cocoamone without torturing puppies, he would gladly employ it. He derives no pleasure from the suffering of the puppies itself. He sympathizes with those who are horrified by the pain and misery of the animals, but the court must realize that human pleasure is at stake. The puppies, while undeniably cute, are mere animals. He admits that he would be just as healthy without chocolate, maybe more so, but this isn't a matter of survival or health. His life would be his life would be unacceptably impoverished without the experience of chocolate.
Okay. Did you want
So,
to speak on that anymore, or?
I mean, that's the. I assume you get where it's going.
No, yeah, I get where it's coming. I just wanted to give you a chance to say anything more if you wanted to.
No, I think we can. It's pretty intuitive. We can go to challenges.
So, right. So what we're saying here is that, there's these certain conditions that we put animals in that are intuitively not worth pleasure of animals, because clearly to this sort of hypothetical we would end up objecting, right? This is sort of the idea.
Yeah, this is the that is a sort of general expression of the idea.
Right. So you heard when I was talking to Brandon that I advocate for a welfarist position, right? So I think that there are utilitarian standards that we owe animals, such that, like, my description of it is if we are going to take an animal out of nature and put it into a situation where we're going to raise it and grow it and kill it, its experience has to be equal to or better than nature already provides. Now, one of the problems of your scenario is that we have these tortured dogs in small cages where they can't possibly move, And this is absolutely not the position I'm willing to defend. And I don't need to defend that in order to take a non-vegan stance, right? I can take a minimal non-vegan. In fact, it is a non-vegan stance for a person to only eat meat once a year by going fishing, taking a fish out of a lake, killing it, and eating it. Because that is not a vegan stance, it is a non-vegan stance. So I do not have to advocate these sort of torturous conditions in order to prove my point of non-veganism. Now, I agree with you. Your example is intuitively objectionable. People would not accept it. Now, if you want
Hmm.
to talk about the differences um, where we simply swap out animal, like a dog or a marginal case human, for, let's say, a pig, a cow, or a chicken, we can talk about the intuitive plausibility of that. But do you agree with me that I don't actually have to defend torturous conditions in order to argue for a non-vegan stance?
Yeah, certainly. The way that the paper ends up going is that you know you could have the most ethical farm that there is, right, where the cows have as happy a life as they could, and
Uh huh.
they are then killed for meat, right, when the time is right. But there's none of the torturing. They're not living in their own feces and all that sort of thing, right?
Right.
Um,
And
so the question would.
there's a
Mhm.
reason why the description you just gave me included those aspects, right?
Well,
Because
right. So.
if you didn't, your case would be so much less convincing. Like if you want to give
Mhm.
me a hypothetical scenario that challenges the view that I'm actually putting forth, you would want to take those factors out and see if you can make a similarly convincing case. And I think it's very doubtful that you can.
Well, I mean, let's see. So, certainly, um, so the reason that it's set up the way it is because he wants to start out um, by talking about factory farms, right?
Yeah,
But he goes on defending a position that is not just that we should um, avoid uh, purchasing products from the factory farm industry, because what he wants to say is, look, so I mean, I was just talking about the super ethical farm with the cow that has the best life you could want,
yeah,
whose life is cut short by being killed for meat. Now, unless you can, so I mean, if we're talking about things being convincing here,
yeah.
and the people to whom this argument is addressed will be asked, okay, so think about if we did this for dogs, and if we did this for dogs, and you wouldn't find this acceptable, then what's the morally relevant difference between the dog and the cow?
Right. Okay. So we can reduce it down to marginal cases. My only point is I just want to say that I think a lot of what was convincing within that statement wasn't anything that leads to veganism specifically, but to poor utilitarian standards. So let's move to marginal cases. Why would we object to dogs being put in the same place as cows, chickens, and whatever else, right? I'm not going to advocate for any mental quality that a dog has over a pig because I don't believe dogs are any more intelligent than pigs. However, I do think we have a long standing relationship with dogs. And if the ethics of care have told us anything, generally our moral obligations start from an inner circle of our family to our friends to our fellow humans to things we cohabitate with, where we don't place those duties onto things that we don't cohabitate and don't form social relationships with. Because we form social relationships with pet animals, we have that sort of view of pet animals. And that's not surprising, really, right? Because when we live with a family and our mothers and our fathers and our brothers and our sisters, we end up with more obligations towards those family members than we do with strangers. I don't think it would be uncontroversial to say that someone would feel obligated to go to their mother's funeral but not a stranger's. So I don't think it would be any weirder to say we have obligations to the animals we socially cohabitate with than the ones we don't.
the thing is, the problem with that argument is that, for anyone who is dealing with cows on a farm level or pigs on a farm level, there's the same degree of cohabitation, if not more.
Generally it's created at a separated distance, right? Like the whole point of taking a pet is to say, I am going to be the caretaker of this being. I am going to be the one who ensures that this animal has a great life. And when you take on those duties, you end up wanting to fulfill them. Then when we raise animals for slaughter, we don't create that relationship. I mean, I would
It's
think it
really
would be very
interesting that you
odd if
say
we
that
did.
because there's a lot of testimony of these, family farmers when they talk about the way that they raise their animals so ethically. And in fact, a lot of them do say that, they develop these deep sort of caring uh, and trusting relationships with these animals, and they really care about them, that they wouldn't be able to uh reach to bring them to have the sort of happy and ethical life that they need for their beef to end up being the high quality that it is.
Uh-huh. So are you saying that they hold to the same standards and duties they put on pet animals as they do to the animals that they raise for meat?
What I'm saying is that I don't see what the morally relevant difference is,
The more
because
relevant difference
the
is the relationship you establish with the animal.
relationship you establish with the animal,
Mhm.
with the
The
animal, or with the the species,
Well,
the
partially,
relationship that
it can
you
be
tend
just the
to
animal,
establish.
right? Like somebody can have a pet pig, right? Well, we wouldn't deny that somebody who takes on a pet pig has some sort of obligation to continue to treat it like any other pet, right? But then there's also a societal standard of where we've all ended up conceptualizing certain animals as pet animals, and then we end up acting in accordance to that societal standard. So because dogs and cats are so common as pet animals here in North America, we can talk about other areas. Um, we as a heuristic don't view those sorts of animals the same as we do with animals that we're more accustomed to being bred for food. Now that's not always the same case. In India, for example, cows can be sacred. You don't kill cows, right? And they hold that same belief. So I think this is one of those culturally relative things. And part of the ethics of care view is to take a look at the relationships you've established within a society as part of your normative structure.
Right, but the relationships you've established is not the same thing as um, focusing on the relationships you've established is not the same thing as focusing on just the kinds of beings with whom you've established the relationships. And I mean, like when you're talking about um, when you're
Well,
talking about
you'd be advocating for a kind of being. You'd be advocating for a sentient kind of being. That's a kind of being. I think you mean more species.
yes, okay, very good quibbling. So I mean, I guess there are certainly people who will fall back on this sort of, you know, cultural relativistic explanation. But in my encounters with people being presented this argument, that's never come up because when I press people on it, and I say, well, look, do you think that just because your culture doesn't treat this animal a certain way that is therefore justified for it um, for you to be okay with treating them this way, but not with another animal that has otherwise no morally relevant distinguishing characteristics. And when I say otherwise, it's sort of the wrong word here because what these people actually believe is that upon reflection, there is no morally relevant distinction. Now, I mean, you can claim that, for some reason, having this history um, is morally relevant, and um, and therefore constitutes a distinguishing characteristic. But you know,
But
that's just going to be a at if we're going to keep arguing on this, like it seems like we're talking past one another. You're saying that it's not convincing to you, and I'm telling you that a lot of people find this convincing.
okay, so you've put forth your case, right? Like I'm not gonna bother with the whole I find this convincing, you find, because when I explain my views to people, they also find them convincing. But that's because you finding your arguments being convincing and my arguments being convincing might just be because we got there first, right? And we're more philosophically inclined and we can do good rhetoric and explain well. So either one of us gets to a person first, we might end up seeing convincing. The point is when we have an audience like this, if we can hear both sides, they can make a judgment call for themselves. My explanation is that care ethics and this idea of relationships is morally valuable to people, and I'm willing to let the audience decide whether or not that's the case. I'll abstract it from the whole idea of this family relationships to friends relationships to acquaintances to humanity as a whole to pet animals, and that obligations trickle down, like they're strongest at our closest relationship, weakest at our smallest relationships. Now, I'm not arguing for pure cultural relativity. I'm generally a value pluralist who would argue that there are multiple um, normative structures at play in anybody's moral position, and that trying to reduce it down to one will always end up with ridiculous reductios. But it seems intuitive that this, what I'm advocating, is a part of most people's moral evaluation. You might feel that it's not, but that's my case.
No, I wouldn't say that it's not a part of their moral evaluation at all. I mean, I'm partial to value pluralism as well. Um, I just think that my experience has just been that when I talk to these people, although they do have the intuitive pull of the fact that they've had what two or three dogs in their lifetime, and they've had close relationships with these dogs. They've even had close relationships with other family members and other friends dogs. Like, this does carry some weight to them, but when they're trying to adjudicate in the end whether those relationships and the sort of psychological um, preference of just dog well-being over pig well-being or cow well-being, they sort of start to see that there's a large element of like moral luck involved here, um, and that if we want to have a real um, some real claim to objectivity, which of course is consistent with value pluralism, then we're going to have to be making comparative judgments as to which of our different, distinct, irreducible values is
Yeah.
going to carry more weight in this situation. So, and again, I don't deny that care ethics. I shouldn't say again because I didn't say this yet. I think care ethics has some wonderfully important insights, and that relationships themselves um, are very important. I just don't think that um, the fact that, say, I mean, for instance, right? Like, I've had more relationships in my life with white people than black people. Does
Uh-huh.
that mean that I should be partial to white people in moral considerations? I don't necessarily think so, and I think that the same sort of thing could be said with uh, with pigs and with dogs.
Well,
Um,
again, yeah, that's why I have to rest on value pluralism because I think there are underpinning things about human beings in general that might explain better or say are more foundational to the explanation of why we would treat any being that I would describe as self-aware as worthy of different moral considerations than one that isn't. And in general, I think there are these pluralistic duties that we give ourselves based off of different qualities. My real point here was to say, because it seemed to what you were saying is that people can't find a morally relevant difference between pigs and dogs. My
Well,
point
some
is to
some people
offer,
can, but
yeah,
yeah.
my point is that, like again, like I was talking about Brandon and name the trait, is that some people are just unable to describe a position, right? They run up against a philosopher. The philosopher challenges them with this question, and because they put no thought into it, they have absolutely nothing to say, right? And that might make them fearful of their own position, like there's something wrong with them. My point is that if I come along and I give this care ethics explanation after hearing that, from you, that they weren't able to come up with an explanation, that they would be willing to switch to my explanation as fundamental as why they treat dogs and pigs differently. Like it would be convincing enough to sway them off of that position.
That's your claim?
Yeah.
So your claim is that, I mean, because it seemed that there was a little thing I caught there, and I'm not sure whether you meant it, but if you did, right, what you said is this is why they treat dogs and pigs differently. Not this is why they're justified in treating dogs and pigs differently. Because I think the former uh is clearly true, that this plays a big role in why they see dogs and pigs differently, and they have intuitively different reactions to um, the story that I presented and the story that would be presented if it were, baby pigs instead of baby dogs. So if
Well, I just can I stop you there because I think if you're looking for justification, I'm going to assume that you and I have different meta-ethical aspects, right? Whereas then I don't think positive actions require justification. What I think is the abstaining of a particular action requires convincing reasons. And if one isn't established, then you can go ahead and do that action, right? And one of the convincing reasons is sensations, right? Like this just feels wrong to me or this makes me guilty. But if you're looking for like epistemic reasons of justification before you can do an action, I don't actually think that's how humans operate.
well, I mean, I didn't say that you need. I didn't say that's how humans operate. What I'm claiming here is that using a sort of thought experiment, we can get ourselves to reflect on certain things that we might have not reflected on before, and come to realize that um, once we have all of the things we recognize as relevant considerations in view, um, we find that we don't actually think a certain practice is justified. That doesn't mean that I am committed to the claim that before you participate in any practice, you need to go through this thought process.
Okay, then we're more on the same page then, right? So then why are you calling for a justification if you don't think people initially need one, right? Because I'm not seeing the distinction here. When I say that I think people would find this as a reason for their behavior, I also mean that they wouldn't have a negative moral sensation to that argument. They'd be like, ah, that does make sense in terms of my values. I do feel that value connection in terms of care ethics to close things, and that does adequately ethically describe why I would be okay um, with certain practices against pigs and not with dogs.
I mean, you just threw the word ethically in where I wouldn't. I mean, I would say yes, we reflect on this stuff, and I start to think about these, care ethical concerns, and I realize that this sort of thing is playing a role in why I have this intuitive, um, yuck, disgusting reaction when I think about it happening to dogs, but I don't when it happens to pigs. Now, then the question becomes, is that a justified? Uh, is the disparity there justified?
Yeah, well, are you appealing to an objective standard? Like just so I'm clear.
Am I appealing to an objective standard? Well, I mean, I do think that most people tend to think of morality in in terms closer to objectivist ones than subjectivist ones.
Yeah, but that wasn't my question. Is are you appealing to an objective standard?
Whether I do it doesn't really matter because what the question is this convincing to people? What do they do when they think about whether it's convincing?
Right, but in order to figure out whether or not we need justification, we need to appeal that people think that, like, when they've gone through this evaluation, when they've listened to your argument and when they listen to my argument, that they're not ethically satisfied, right? Because that what else are we going to mean when we're talking about being ethically convincing, right? So that my question is, when you say they haven't met their burden of justification, are we going outside of the debate proposition of being ethically convinced into more objective standards? Because if we're not, then I'm not sure how I see the thrust of your objection.
Well, I think that there's a little bit of eh, what do I call it here? It's a little bit of not exactly hand waving because that's a little strong. But when you say, "Look, are you going outside of the question of whether it's ethically convincing, um, and finding some sort of objective or presupposing or requiring some sort of objective justification, I don't see why that's necessarily going outside of the whether it's ethically convincing.
Okay, well, I just think people can find things ethically convincing whether or not it follows an objective standard or not.
I didn't deny that, but
So then why do we need to
that
look
doesn't
at an
mean
objective justification? Like, I just don't know if that's the realm you want to bring the conversation to. Are you looking to talk about whether or not it's objectively justified or not?
all I'm saying is that that is, as a matter of fact, what many people are asking themselves when they're asking whether the argument is ethically convincing. I'm not saying
Yeah, no,
everyone's doing
I'm
that.
fine with that, right? But if you believe that there's an objective standard, right, and somebody asks themselves, "Do I objectively think that this is the ethical thing to do?" They could say yes. Meanwhile, they're also wrong to the actual objective standard.
Yeah, okay, that is I don't object to what you just said, but what's the upshot?
Well, the upside is we're only really talking about whether or not someone finds it ethically convincing, right? So if somebody says, okay, Shadow, I've heard your argument. It has ethically convinced me. I ethically think that this is objectively the case, right? Then that's my argument served. That's all I had to do. I didn't actually have to create an objective standard and actually show that they matched it. The question is if they find it convincing. So they've asked themselves, do I think this is objectively right? And they say yes.
Can you repeat that? I'm really not following where you're going.
Okay, I'm saying that if I give my argument and somebody finds it ethically convincing and that they themselves are objectivists, then they likely think of it in objective standards. Yes, Shadow, the argument you gave me is objectively correct because that's generally how they're going to frame any ethical arguments for them. Whether or not that's true or not, whether or not it matches an ethical standard, that's completely besides the point, right? That would be between you and me to determine whether or not there is an objective meta ethical stance and that we can match it.
Okay, so that means what?
That means the only burden I have is that somebody finds it ethically convincing.
The only burden you have?
Yeah, for this debate
No.
proposition, we only have to talk about whether it's ethically convincing to someone.
You have to show that there are no ethically convincing vegan arguments. So the fact that someone finds your response to my argument ethically convincing in objectivist terms
Well, do you
is
want me to
irrelevant.
go back up to our clarification on the debate topic?
I heard the clarification. I mean,
Well, what was the clar do you would you like to restate it for the audience? Do you actually think it's my burden to show every possible vegan argument and then whether or not it's convincing or not? Because I will gladly go scroll back up to where we talked about the debate proposition and how it would go. And I don't see how what we're doing or what I'm
scroll
doing is
back up
anywhere
as did
outside
you
of
do
that.
it in the chat? Did you do it in the chat? Or are you talking
Yeah,
about
we
something
we
you did in
had
the
this
chat?
we had this conversation in the chat.
Was this today or like days ago?
I think it was yesterday or maybe 2 days ago. You asked
Okay,
me about the
then I
debate proposition. And I said what we would do is we would present convincing arguments back and forth, and we would let the audience decide whether or not they are ultimately convincing or not. The whole idea of me showing this entire broad case that there can exist no convincing arguments to anyone is obviously not what we're trying to establish to begin with. Like, we agreed on that.
well, right. No, not that there's no convincing arguments to anyone, but that there are no convincing arguments.
Yeah, and we would do that by presenting arguments back and forth. You would present one, I would say what I find not good enough about that argument. This is how we talked about how the debate would go.
Okay, okay, okay. Got you. I got you. So, okay. So again, so you're relying here on the care ethical premise, correct? Is that what's doing the heavy lifting responding to me?
Yeah,
Right. So what's your argument? Because I mean, I responded with the like, I have more relationships with white people than black people in my life, but that doesn't follow that I should be morally partial to white people. Um, and you said that, right, that's why I'm a pluralist, because I think that there are some fundamental things about humans that sort of um, will correct for that, right?
right. So,
Right.
and I think you would agree that our conception of human is already strong enough that we would not seek to kill them and eat them for food, right?
Yeah. Right. So, can you give me a justification as to why that the distinction between white and black people here, and not talking about necessarily eating for food. I'm just talking about moral preferential treatment as to why that would not be justified in um, in the human case with white and black, but would be justified in the animal case with, um, killing pigs and cows for food, but not dogs.
Because I think generally what underpins societal morality or any of the beings that are participants within the society is generally a meritocracy. We almost always reduce it down to what you're capable of or the virtues of a person. We find those more fundamental than the care ethics can establish. Now, care ethics generally goes on top of baselines, right? So when we talk about duties to my father, that ends up being on top of generally what my duties to humans are. And I would say that the moral baseline for humans already covers like merit based thinking or value based thinking. What type of personality, what type of character does this person have, and what types of actions are they able to do? And generally, for participants in society, that becomes the moral baseline of how we make judgment.
So, what
So
what what exactly are
I
the
don't know what
principles that the
additional duties you would
meritocracy for
even
the
have.
dogs? What's the meritocracy for dogs?
The meritocracy for dogs, I wouldn't say they're participants, they're pets.
I fail to see how what you just said applies to the dog and cow and pig case.
It doesn't. I just gave you a moral baseline for participants with society. You pointed out dogs. I said they're not participants. In general, pets are covered under care ethical view.
So do you think people would agree to the proposition that uh, even if we didn't have dogs as pets, then, or sorry, that if we didn't have dogs as pets, then it would be, totally fine to do, uh, totally fine to do what we do to cows and pigs to dogs.
I think asking somebody who does have that view of pets must just be like a false way of asking a question. Go ahead and ask it to anyone who does not have that view of dogs as pets, and I think you will find the answer is yes.
And why do you think that? I mean, earlier you were attacking Brandon for just having things as intuitions.
Well, I mean, we have like the China case, right? Like where they'll have the Yulin Dog Festival, and that's not seen as weird in their culture. You have India with their view on cows. We can obviously see that different societies form different care ethical relationships with animals, and that they live by them. So there's no point of asking somebody who has a specific feeling toward dog, can you see dogs any differently, please? Well, of course they can.
I thought there was something special about pets, though.
Is that, what do you mean? Yeah, to
Wasn't the
us,
claim?
within our society, there is something special to us about the pets. And in other society, the animals that they believe are pets would also share that same sort of relationships with those animals.
But even, I mean, I don't think it's true that in India, like, people keep cows as pets. Like, that's not the justification for not eating cows.
Well, cows, they have like a religious significance within India. Like they form their own
Right? Yeah.
relationship with them,
Uh huh.
but it's a relationship that's certainly outside of the bounds of like a normal relationship you have, like a default relationship you would have with an animal.
Hmm. I don't know what a default relationship with an animal would even be,
One
but
where there's no established relationship, like us with, I don't know, squirrel.
so, um, I mean, you want your position of this welfareism thing to me, though. It seems to require certain special, caring, care ethical type relationships with the animals that you slaughter.
No, no. My grounding of welfareism is just purely on utilitarian values. Like I think any animal, regardless, is owed those sort of utilitarian considerations. Like that's a baseline for all animals. Is like you don't torture them, you don't beat them, you give them, you know, you make sure that your interactions with them don't cause them this immense suffering, which is obviously like a failing within society at the moment. But that's where I would argue is a baseline. Now, if you're asking me like why would we kill one and not the other, then I would say it's because we have these care ethical attitudes towards certain animals that we have social relationships too.
I mean, and then you do think that, as a matter of fact, killing killing the animal for meat is justified on utilitarian grounds.
Yeah, well, I don't think it justified on utilitarian grounds sounds weird. It's not unjustified on utilitarian grounds.
Well, I mean, you have to make the claim that it does maximize utility.
That it has to I never said maximize utility, nor do I think it really takes away from utility.
Okay, well then, sorry,
If we're
I
to,
interpreted you a little too literally, but
well,
I mean,
I said prior that our utilitarian interactions with animals should be equal to or better than nature. Now, that's not a maximization statement.
okay, and I mean, where's the argument uh for that obtaining?
Where's the argument for that? I don't understand the question.
Where's the argument for the claim that, as a matter of fact, when we do raise and then eventually kill animals for food, albeit in a, as you defined, humane way, that we are giving them a life that is better for them than they would have in nature?
Oh, sure. Like, are you asking how would we epistemically justify that we're doing so?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, I think we can make certain inductive cases. I mean, we can observe animals in the wild. We know that animals get eaten alive. We know that they suffer disease. We know that they don't have abundance of source. We know that they don't have ample
Well,
shelter from the elements, right? And these are all things that we can easily provide. We can provide meals on time. We can make sure that they have shots so that they don't have diseases. We can protect them from predators. We can make sure that their environments are, temperature adequate, so that the experiences are pleasurable while giving them generally the things that animals want to do, which is like enough space to interact and move around and that sort of thing. So I think it just seems intuitively obvious that we have the capacity to beat nature in utilitarian standards.
it's funny that, it's just intuitively obvious. It seems that you were, really pushing back on this earlier.
Well, I mean, if you disagree, if you don't also share those intuitions, I mean that might be a problem. But I'm sort of uh, believing that you probably would.
Yeah, no, I mean, I, I'm definitely not convinced.
You're definitely not convinced that being fed, having shelter, protection from predators, and all those sorts of things is better than what nature provides.
Right.
Is there something in nature that you think that animals need that we weren't able to give?
No, I'm not sure, but I just don't know how I could make the comparison when I have no idea how the animals that we now farm ever lived in nature
But we know
because
how
we have.
animals generally live in nature. Is there something special about farm animals that would be a radically different sort of life?
I don't know. I think that animals differ in how they experience nature, especially nowadays, given that we've sort of stolen the entire world from them.
Okay, so are you agnostic towards what would be good for an animal?
Not completely. I'm agnostic as to whether your claim about, giving them a better life is true.
What do you mean? Like whether or not we could even theoretically do it? You're saying that's
No,
questionable?
about whether we could know that the kind of life we give them in farms is better than the kind of life they would have in nature.
Oh, okay. Do you think animals are happy to eat?
um, I think it depends what they eat, but anyways, so
But that didn't answer my question. Do you think animals are happy to eat?
I did answer your question. It depends what they eat.
Okay. Are they happy to eat foods that they seem to exhibit behaviors that they move towards with excitement?
Yeah, probably.
Right. Can we provide those? Is that a logically possible thing to do?
Yep.
Do you think nature does provide them on time all the time? Like it has any guarantee?
I think it depends on the animal, and I don't know because, like I said, I don't know what they lived like in the wild because we literally made them uh, domestic animals.
So you're not really
Anyways,
sure if animals have food shortages out in nature.
I'm not sure if they would have um, had we never domesticized them in the way that we do. I mean, it's
Okay, well,
plausible.
I've never heard of this. Like, we can empirically go verify this by watching animals, but
No,
I'm
we
already
can't. No, we can't because we took the Earth from them. We don't know what it was like before we took the Earth from them.
okay. What are you talking? There's still places where there's animals living that humans aren't. In fact, that's the majority of the planet.
Yes. Uh, well, I guess the ocean. Yeah, sure. Uh, but um,
Now, if you view 1,000 species struggling with food shortages, I would think it would be fine to say that farm animals aren't going to be any special exception.
right. And you would also have to take into account the massive amount of damage we've done to ecosystems across the world and how much that has endangered their food supply. I assume that we're not really getting anywhere though, but if you have any last
Well,
sort
I
of,
think you're just kind of just bailing out on this point because I just think it's quite obvious.
you
I'll
think
be
I'm
with you
bailing
too.
out? Okay, so I mean, you heard what I just said about the environment. Do you think that has absolutely nothing to do with the amount of food shortages we see in wild animals?
Yeah, I think animals would have food shortages whether or not we're doing ecological damages. And I'm sure we can go to areas where there's very minimal human interaction in order to verify this. I don't think nature is this state where food is delivered on a plate. However, in human societies, that's exactly what you can accomplish.
Okay, so uh, I mean, yeah, that's fair. I never thought it was delivered on a plate. Of course, there are going to be some food shortages some of the time. I don't know whether it would be as widespread as it is now, but I mean, I see people in the chat saying uh, this is irrelevant, and I think I agree. I we It
Okay,
seems
no,
like
I
you and
think you're just
you.
trying to bail out on this. The whole
I
point
think
is
that's
you
what
want
you
to
would
establish
say.
that
Of
we
course,
can't
that's
give
what you want to say.
utilitarian standards better than animals, but you want to make a few points and then not listen to any counter objections to that, so you can say, "Oh, well, okay, we're wasting time. Okay, bye." Right? Why wouldn't it be convincing that we can create utilitarian standards better for animals than nature can provide? It's
Can
not the
we? Can
argument that we
Wait,
do.
wait.
It's the
No, no,
argument
no,
that
no,
we
no, no,
can.
no, no, no. So, uh, you have to factor in the uh,
Arco, it is relevant to the proposition because the
you have to.
proposition is whether or not vegan arguments are convincing. And if I can show that a welfarist stance is more convincing than a non welfarist stance, then it would bolster my point. So I don't know what your objection is.
So,
The
okay, to be clear, go ahead if you have some specific.
No, okay. What is the argument? Like, is your argument that you think is convincing is that we couldn't figure out whether or not farm animals are having higher utilitarian standards?
Well, I mean, one problem I always have with utilitarianism is how exactly we're going to assign these values. And uh, so the crucial thing that you're leaving out of the picture here is that um, a huge amount of these animals' lives are being taken away. Um, we're killing them. So
Uh-huh.
we feed them, we plump them up. Um, might also be interesting to ask whether, having zero food shortages and arguably a food surplus is actually good for the animals. But leaving that aside, whether this idyllic life that they experience for the time that they are alive,
Uh-huh.
um, whether that's not counterbalanced by the killing and thus the deprivation of all of the life they would have otherwise had.
Uh-huh. Right. So my position is that our dealings with animals should be on those utilitarian standards. But if you're saying, does that counterbalance the killing of the animals? I've heard no convincing arguments that we shouldn't. What is the argument that we should? Like if you're just saying, well, that's obvious, then you're not really presenting an argument
Wait,
position.
what? What? I didn't. The argument that what?
Why do I have to counterbalance something that I haven't accepted as wrong?
Killing an animal is not wrong. Killing an animal unnecessarily is not wrong. I guess
That's
that's
the
where
position.
I think that most people would disagree with you there.
Okay, well, I don't think most people would disagree with that. I don't think it has to be a life or death situation to kill an animal. We already have that relationship, and we've had that relationship for thousands of years. Why do you want me to think that people already have an ethical commitment to never do it?
Oh, but also, I mean, we've had slavery for thousands of years, and people were, not that upset about it for a long time. I mean, the
I'm
slaves
sure the
were
slaves
not
were upset
super.
about it.
The slaves might have been upset about it, but who really cares what they think? Like, I don't have to listen to their view.
What is are you saying that we're ignoring the animal's view? Is that like the analogy we're drawing?
No, not necessarily, because they might not object to the life that they're given. I think that if they,
So then you
you
would
know,
say it's disanalogous. You would say it's disanalogous to the slavery case because slaves would object to the life that they were given.
well, it's disanalogous on that, uh, like along those lines, but
And
it's
I would say those are
analogous
really
on the
relevant.
those are really relevant lines. But
Yeah, the fact that
you
slaves
know,
don't want to be slaves is a rather relevant line as
right?
disanalogous.
And wouldn't it, the fact that animals don't want to be killed might be relevant.
Do you think animals don't want to be killed?
Are you fucking kidding me?
Do you think animals have a conception of their life?
Yes.
Okay. Where do you get do you think human infants have a conception of their life?
No.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So you've just said something that's about 100 times more complex than an animal can't do something that an animal can.
A human infant is 100 times more complex than an animal?
Yeah, in terms of neuronal complexity, yes.
What? What did you say?
The density and amount of neurons within an in a human being is about 100 times more than a given animal. So,
Right?
what is it you think that things with less capabilities can do more? Like, do you think animal infants have a concept of life?
Um, I don't know.
You don't know, but you're definitely sure that infants don't.
No, I think I was a little hasty. I'm not sure.
Yeah, right,
I
yeah.
don't know exactly what like conception of life means here.
Okay, well then why did you take such a strong stance to it?
Well, just reacted with intuitions.
Okay, well now that you've explored that intuition, why don't you think about it some? What
Uh-huh.
reason do we have to believe that a human infant has a conception of life?
A conception of life.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell me like what you mean by this?
Well, you said animals don't want to die, they want to be
Like, do
alive,
I
that
think that
sort of thing.
human
Do
infants
they
don't want to
under
die?
I'm not asking if
Are
they
you
have
asking me that?
behaviors that lead to life. I'm asking, do they have an understanding of what it is to be alive?
I mean, I don't know that I need to say yes to that to say that they don't want to die.
Well, go ahead and explain to me what don't want to die means if it's not a conception of life or wanting that conception of life to continue.
Well, don't want to die just means not having a desire to die. You don't have
Right.
to have a desire
So
not to die.
okay, then I can agree that animals don't want to die because they have absolutely no conception of what death is. Now, is that sort of the case that you wanted to build to begin with?
I mean, the, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that we like really know enough about
Right. So
non-human animal cognition to be making these claims like so
yeah, I'm going to say
confidently.
that this is almost always what happens when I talk to vegans is that they always make these strong statements about animals not wanting to die. And anytime I press them on the mental qualities that would allow for such a thing, they just go straight to agnosticism all of a sudden.
Just to be clear, you said not want to die.
It was
It's
your
pretty
initial claim.
obvious that they Yeah, it's pretty obvious that they don't want to die.
Yeah, and they don't want to live either.
I don't know about that.
Well, if
I
you
mean,
want to make a case for it, make a case for it. I've already given you some basic premises, which you seem to be struggling with.
Oh, basic premises I seem to be struggling with. Can I hear those again?
Yeah, human infants don't have a conception of life. Do animals have do infant animals have a conception of life? You seem to be willing to bite the bullet initially that humans don't have a conception of life, but then all of a sudden, when I compared it to animals, all of a sudden uncomfortable with that.
No, well, I mean, I think the discomfort came from just a general, like, I was in the process of reflecting on conception of life generally after having given a quick reaction to the human one, and so I uh started to doubt myself. If I claim that human animals don't have, sorry, that human infants don't have a conception of life, then certainly non-human animal infants also wouldn't.
Okay, great. I'm glad that at least we agree on that point. Do you think that there's anything within animal cognition that would lead to building a concept of life? Because I will give you my case for what I think it is in humans.
Do I think that there's anything? I really don't know enough about non-human animal cognition, but sure, I'll hear out what you have to say about humans.
I would say that the idea of a conception of human life is built off of language. That you
Okay.
need language in order to build concepts, abstract concepts, like being alive. Something that takes you out of just basic instinctual phenomenological experiences and more into abstract concepts is what language gives us.
I mean, uh like, I don't think it's so black and white though. I mean, don't you think that a dog has a concept of um that a dog has a concept of sort of what is expected of it, right? I mean, uh there's a lot of evidence of dogs exhibiting sort of like behavior that seems to only be plausibly explained as shame, right? Uh,
Okay.
emotions like, right? So I mean, how could a dog why would a dog ever be ashamed um, for not following the rules or doing something it uh, had the belief in some primitive sense that it shouldn't do without
Right, like you're
something like an
asking,
abstract concept?
right, because essentially shame for an animal, like from a dog, is going to come from yelling at it. It's going to be a reaction to those sorts of experiences. And then you're going to build, like, through, call it conditioning, that if this action, then this consequence of being yelled at. So, in what way do you need like a thick abstract concept in order to come to shame?
I didn't say a thick abstract concept, just to
Okay,
be
any
clear.
abstract concept, that's fine. Any abstract concept.
I mean, isn't abstraction just what happens when you sort of go beyond particulars to form some sort of general or universal, right? And so this sort of pattern, several times uh, conditioned into the dog sees similarities between certain experiences, and the clustering of that together sort of consolidates it into a primitive concept.
Yeah, but how would you handle that conscious like thinking aspect? Like I agree to you that we can make these sort of heuristic unconscious decisions. And I think we do that all the time. Both humans and non-human animals do this. And I'm not going to deny that. But when we talk about the sorts of concepts that we think about, it seems to require animals to even consider them.
Say the last part again.
We seem to need language in order to even consider them, think through our concepts like this in the abstract sense. We need language in order to be able to hold on to those concepts. They become representations for those concepts.
Uh, yeah, that's true. I don't think that animals have the sort of like metacognition that we do. I mean, non-human animals have the sort of metacognition that we do.
Yeah, and I'm sure you would agree a concept like life or death is something more than just pure experience.
Yeah, but does it mean that an animal can't come to a conception of death? Like, if an animal sees many other animals die over, throughout its lifetime in a routine way, as I'm sure you've seen footage of like cows when they go up to the gun that's going to, go like bolt right through their head. They start, reacting as if they know exactly what's going to happen. They're freaking out. So you don't want to call this a conception of death?
No, I would completely deny that initial premise because you've already baked into it the way that they're considering what's occurring. And you can just shoot the cow in front of them and watch them go limp. You don't need a conception of death to just have that be scary, right? And as people like Temple Grandin has shown, most of the adverse reactions that animals have in slaughterhouse lines comes down to things, elements like lighting or like the ground below them shows a steep drop and they're scared of things. She's been able to like manipulate environments in order to make complacent animals in line. So why would I need to establish this more complex version of understanding in order to talk about animal behavior? Like I don't know if you're aware of like the principle of Morgan's canon, but it's generally don't describe with a higher order mental state that which a lower mental order state adequately describes. Like I don't know if you're against that, but I
That
think
sounds,
like that's just a general
yeah, right. It
principle
just
that
sounds
makes
like
sense.
Occam's razor. Yeah. But I mean, so just to be clear, then, right? I don't see why we need them to be afraid of some abstract concept of death. Uh, just, I mean, it seems sufficient to say that they desire not that, whatever they perceive that to be.
What is it that you're thinking that they don't desire? Like if you're saying that we can't even make a concept of it, but they're still scared of it, or they still want this thing, but have no concept of what that even is. I don't see how that's a coherent view or why we should ever believe that.
Say it again.
I, I don't understand how your view is coherent to say something is wants X or doesn't want X when you're unwilling to attribute the ability for them to conceptualize that.
Right. No, I'm saying we don't need to say that they want not to die.
What is it you are saying they want?
They want not to have that shit happen. Where that shit is the thing that they see repeatedly over and over again, and then react to clearly negatively when it comes to the point that it's going to happen to them.
What is it we're exposing animals to repeatedly for them to even say I don't want that?
Well, there are several negative things, but the context here is like
Like I don't think there's
slaughter.
animal viewing shows of slaughter. Like we don't go, come on, bring all the farm animals in. We're gonna do the slaughter now. Line up in the audience and please observe.
Nobody said that.
Right. But then I don't understand how it is you think animals are viewing this thing over again in order to form this negative conception.
I mean, in in slaughterhouses, they just do see it.
Do you want me to like post some like footage of just animals going down a line and they don't really see anything and then they just die?
I mean, you can show me that, yeah, some footage of
Post a
that,
Kev,
and
for
I
example,
I can,
just say
and there is absolutely footage of what I'm talking about too. I'm not saying it's the only thing that happens, but it certainly happens.
But you know what I'm advocating for, right? Right? Like if something's going to lead to some sort of negative state, then I would be less for it than I would be for something else. So if I can show you an example of what I consider acceptable slaughter, then that's what I end up advocating. And it's still a non-vegan position. So you're going to have to argue me off of what I can show.
I mean, you can go ahead and do that. I don't know whether you just associate with, all sorts of sociopaths, but I don't know anyone who watches a video and just decides, oh yeah, that's good enough for me.
Are you calling me a sociopath because I've witnessed the footage? Like I'm not sure what you're saying.
No, I'm not calling you a sociopath. I'm just saying that uh, if you if you don't think that if you think that generally, or if your experience has been that generally people find um, this kind of argument on your that you are offering more convincing than the kind of argument that I am offering, then they might have, you know sort of pathologically low levels of empathy.
Okay, and then I'm going to offer the counter case that they don't have pathological of empathy and they have regular empathy,
All right.
right? Like why should I believe that they have less levels of empathy when they see slaughter that's done in a way that the animal isn't freaked out, that they don't find it wrong, and then I'm gonna like start labeling them some psychological issues.
Yeah.
And they what Bohan, the entire process is shown. The stunning, the shooting, the slitting, everything is shown in the clip.
Yeah, I really don't want to fucking see that. I winced when it came up on my screen. So,
Okay. Well, that's fine. But when I'm advocating conditions that don't freak animals out, and when we're trying to relate it back to the point we were previously talking about animals not being able to form conceptions of death because they're not witnessing this thing over and over again. Not that that would even be a concept of death. It would just be I'm scared of what that thing that's occurring, right? Then here you go. Here's a case where that's not a happening. So that's all I really need to advocate for.
that doesn't show that, the utilitarian justification goes through. It just shows that, you're not convinced by what I said. But
What? No, it is my counter argument to your position. Like, first, we're talking about can we have utilitarian standards greater than nature? You seem to come to some sort of agnostic position in which, we can't be sure whether or not feeding an animal, giving them shelter or protection from predators would be utilitarianly better than nature, right? Okay, and my position is that we can't. Then you said that animals have conceptions they don't have conceptions of wanting to die, which we said was just trivially true because animals don't have conceptions at all. Then you weren't really sure about that. And we started talking about these sorts of scenarios in which you think they can develop negative reactions to witnessing certain things, and I'm showing something where they don't witness anything or gain fear. So what isn't it that I haven't addressed at this point from your argumentation?
well, I mean, I think at this point you've made your points. We have some pretty lower level disagreements, like more fundamental disagreements. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, we both have the values of, respecting sentient life and
Not
uh,
treating them like shit.
not treating them like shit. And I'm not convinced that, and also, the care ethical ones, and I guess I'm just not convinced, but about your I'm not convinced by your argument for prioritizing care ethical concerns when it comes
Right.
to
Well,
dogs.
of course, like when it comes into this debate, I have no belief that you're going to convince me or that I'm going to convince you. I don't think that's going to happen. And I almost think that if one of us converted over a single conversation, then our previous positions were somewhat disingenuous to begin with. But the point is that we put out our arguments as best we can, and we can let other people decide. So there's no point of saying whether or not we're convincing or not. Other people can make that decision for themselves.
Right. Of course, that's all we can let them do.
Okay. Is there any other arguments for like veganism you'd be willing to investigate? Do you want to hear any other particular claims that I have against veganism that you would like to argue against?
Anything specific against veganism that you haven't raised as to why like veganism is
Well, I did raise
uh
them with Brandon, but we never really talked about it again. With like when I talked about veganism has troubles definitionally. Like nobody can really decide what a vegan even is. And
yeah,
I
so
said,
I mean I don't think that's any more of a problem for the person you're arguing against than it is for you when your proposition is that there are no convincing vegan arguments.
do you think people would find switching to veganism less convincing if there is no definition of vegan and it just seems to be what everybody just decides is reasonable?
Yeah, but I mean like when you uh I'm sort of confused as to what your point is because if you're conceding that there are all these different definitions of veganism, then
Uh,
I don't like presumably there are some really permitting conceptions of veganism, and then you don't think those are problematic, right? You wouldn't argue against those because they fit your view.
which ones are permitting that are also vegan?
I mean, you hear I've heard someone on Ask Yourself talking about how uh, he's vegan and he only eats meat.
Uh-huh. But do you think that would be welcomed by the vegan society? Like generally, people who call themselves vegans, do you think they would welcome them as a fellow vegan?
Um, no, generally no.
Okay. So when we talk about the people who generally consider each other vegan, right? There's like this cluster of people who would agree that each other are ethically vegan. That entire group doesn't seem to be able to come to any consensus of what a vegan actually is. And I'm saying that raises a point against veganism as a convincing philosophy.
Okay, so I mean, let's try this out then. Um, there are all sorts of different Christians, right? And they
Hmm.
don't agree on what it really means to be a Christian.
Yeah, and that does make Christianity less convincing, doesn't it? When you actually sit and reflect on that.
Uh, I don't know. It depends on whether there's one whether there are more and less reasonable sects of Christianity, right? Like, and I think that
Uh-huh.
that's probably true of veganism, right? And so I don't know if it would make sense to say that like because people quarrel over the definition of vegan, um, that's a point against veganism because even there you have to specify which sect of veganism you're talking about. It might be a point against the really unreasonable vegans, but I don't see how it's a point against the more
Well,
Uh,
I'm more talking about the core part. Like I would say core to Christianity is believing in Christ, right? And believing that the Bible is the religious text of your religion. I don't know what is core to veganism that makes anyone a vegan, other than the fact that they just don't eat meat, derivative animal products. That seems to be the only aspect that I can find that is important. That, and it's an ethical position. You take it for some sort of ethical reason.
so that's interesting that people have been saying that in this conversation because it's something I had never heard of, but the last part. But yeah, I agree on the core.
Okay. So yeah, the core is some actions that you don't do and doing them for some sort of ethical, but they're almost like
I don't
the
I mean, I
ethical
deny
reason.
the last part, but
Oh, you don't think veganism has to be an ethical position? That's what you mean?
yeah, no.
Okay. Um,
It was
that's
literally just
fine.
an like, it wasn't until a couple days ago on Discord I saw people being like, "Oh, that means you're plant-based if you're not an ethical vegan." I had
Okay.
never heard
Well,
that position before.
maybe that's just because like I've participated in a lot of vegan debates, and people who are willing to take vegan debates often hold that anyone doesn't have an ethical stance is plant based. um, I don't disagree that like you can have this broader idea, and probably even society um, generally holds the view that just abstaining from animal products, even if you don't care about the ethics at all, or you just feel like doing it for a diet, is vegan. Some people believe that, right? But that like those aren't convincing cases to go vegan, right? Like, hey, try out this fad diet. That's not really like an ethical commitment. That's why I generally try to restrict the definition into the ethical vegan realm, because that's one of the ones that like seems to give some thrust as to why you should be vegan, like where people try and convince each other based off of their values.
Mhm.
So hopefully you don't have a problem with that. And then within that realm of those ethical vegans, I don't think that there's any particular normative structure that even underpins the view.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you could be a vegan for utilitarian reasons, or you could be a vegan because you hold some sort of animal rights position, or you could hold a virtue ethical position. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we can investigate those positions, because generally, I mean, I'll argue that utilitarian vegans are shitty at being utilitarian vegan. Like,
I
would you want to
mean,
hear an
yeah,
argument against that,
sure.
or you?
No, I mean, I think utilitarians in general are shitty at being utilitarians. There are a few exceptions, but I think that's, just part of a broader problem.
Okay, so like one of like the statements that vegans would give you is that an animal's life is not worth a human's taste pleasure, something like that, right? You would agree that's like a very common vegan ethical belief.
I can't hear you. I don't know where you went, but yes, yeah,
Oh,
I agree.
oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. But then if I gave you a scenario where vegetable X in its production caused, let's say, a certain number of deaths in order to produce it, and vegetable Y produced X plus one, so it produces more deaths, either one of those vegetables is nutritionally adequate so that you can survive off of either one of them. Um, and it's the case that the one that causes slightly more deaths is way better for human, like people enjoy it that much more. Do you think vegans would rally behind the idea that you can't eat that vegetable, that it's wrong to eat that vegetable?
Do I think that they would rally behind it? No, I don't think that they would rally behind it.
Right. So
Do
there you go. I will eat my neighbor's saying both vegetables. So this whole idea of underpinning things with um, human taste pleasure isn't worth an animal life doesn't actually seem to be consistently applied. Like the
Well,
amount of crop deaths that something creates isn't even a consideration for they don't care.
um, I
So
think that's true of.
okay. So it
Go
really
ahead.
seems to be like this direct eating meat. Like it's not about the animal's life particularly. It's the fact that we're doing it in a specific way, or that it's this directness of it that seems to underpin the view. I think that's less convincing than the initial premise that a vegan would put forth of saying an animal's life is not worth your taste buds, right? Like if that was consistently applied, that prima facie sounds convincing, but then it's not even like consistently applied. That's not actually the vegan's position.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, let's see. Is it like because when you say that this is like a common vegan, you know,
Adage, I guess.
yeah, right, exactly. The question is like, is it a moral principle or is it like a slogan that's, you know what I mean, that's used as a sort of like quick propaganda, you know, type
Uh-huh.
of move?
And that was sort of like one of the things I wanted to talk about during this debate is that there are vegan arguments that prima facie sound convincing, but on inspection aren't as convincing as they seem, right? So that was one of the things I elucidated earlier,
I think that's
right?
certainly true that there are bad arguments for veganism. Of course
Okay.
there are bad arguments for any view.
So then what we're looking for is something that actually underpins vegan position. If it's not the fact that, animal lives aren't worth more than a human's pleasure, then what is it? Right? If it's not about animal lives, then is it just about the particular way we've gone about doing it? Because the welfare stance takes care of that. Is it just the fact that it's like direct? It is the fact that there's like a knife involved. Like what becomes the underpinning difference of animal agriculture over just lives that we decide are fine to cost just for whatever other reason?
You're asking what the fundamental bedrock of veganism is?
I'm just asking you to give a fundamental bedrock. It doesn't have to be the one, but can you give a one?
Yeah, I mean, what I would give is I subscribe to something like Christine Korsgaard's view. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her most recent book.
I haven't read it, but I am familiar of it. But you can go ahead and just say what it is.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea is basically that, um, I'm sure you know Kant's categorical imperative, and we have the formula of universal law,
Uh
and then
huh.
the formula of humanity as an end in itself.
Yeah.
What Korsgaard claims is that the way that the formula of humanity should really be applied is not that we only treat rational beings as ends in themselves, but we treat all beings uh, who sort of experience um, the world as better or worse for them according to what happens to them.
Mm-hmm.
For any being who experiences the world that way, we ought to take them into consideration in our actions, and to the greatest extent possible, we ought to respect um, their desires to be treated, better and not worse.
Now, do you think vegans actually do to the greatest extent possible? Is that like something that vegans actually do or advocate?
No,
No.
but again, like what vegans do is separate, because what Christians do or what Muslims do is not necessarily
No,
tied
I'm not.
to the
I
best argument
sorry.
you can give for their view.
I'm totally fine with vegans not actually doing it as long as they're advocating that's what we're supposed to be doing. But I don't think vegans do that either.
Right, and I don't think that Christians, always advocate for treating people in the way that, their biblical Jesus would want them to. But
Okay,
that's
that's
not an
fine.
argument against Christianity. That's an argument against being a Christian in that way. Just like it's an argument against being a dogmatic vegan.
Uh-huh. Well, okay. Maybe you're saying this underpins the view, or at least your view.
No, this
Like,
is
are
this is what this is how I justify it. This is why I think it makes sense.
so this is okay. Your personal view is that we should do everything possible to treat things as ends.
Yeah,
Okay. Now, do you think the previous scenario that we talked about with those vegetables that is doing everything possible or not?
I think it depends on certain other circumstances, right? Like if these vegetables are like equally like nutritionally adequate and in
Yeah.
cost there's no disparity and in terms of like environmental impact there's no disparity and all these things, um then yeah, it would make sense uh to favor one over the other.
Right. So you would say that we have an obligation to abstain from the vegetable that causes the +1 amount of deaths.
No, I didn't say that,
Well, what would you say?
but
How would you word?
I'm not exactly sure because in terms of like how exactly this is supposed to be worked out on the ground level, like because we also have all sorts of other ethical obligations, right? Like we can't spend uh, all of our moral um, energy and sort of attention to ensuring that we're living the most uh, vegan life possible because there are all sorts of other things we need to be doing. I mean, I like I'm sympathetic to Kant's view that there are also like moral duties to oneself to develop one's talents and to develop friendships with peers and like there's all sorts of things we need to be doing. So uh
Uh-huh.
to expect us to be like moral saints in every arena of life is overblown. But
Kant's
that doesn't
view is that there are absolute and non-absolute um, imperatives, and the ones that are absolute we should always be doing, like abstaining from lying, and that there are other ones that we should be doing occasionally, like going out to help people. Like we can't constantly be in a state of helping people. Yeah, that's what it is. Perfect and imperfect. Right? I use the wrong. Um, and would you say that this duty of not treating animals as ends is perfect or imperfect duty? Because it sounds like a perfect duty.
right, but the way of constructing the example is not exactly accurate because it's because of the distance between the consumer and the production, right?
But
Um,
I mean, let me. I think this is an epistemic point, right? Like you're saying that people can't know that one vegetable is so much better than another vegetable, and it's hard to go and gather that knowledge. I'm willing to grant you that, and so that would reflect in people's actions. What I'm asking you is if people had the knowledge, do you expect them to make that decision?
just to be clear, I that's not exactly where I was going. I was going to say that uh, because of the the sort of uh, like there if um yeah, I mean, I'm honestly, I don't know what my take is on that.
Okay. I'll just move on to other criticisms that I have. Is that one of the problems is that almost always the view of life for vegans is not that human lives are less than animal lives. Generally, they consider humans as worth more than animals. My problem is that this almost always relies on a sentience hierarchy, and that there is no actual clear concept of what the hell a sentience hierarchy is, or how it's measured, or why humans would ever be at the top of it. So, do you agree that humans are worth more than other animals in general considerations?
I don't know. This is there's interesting debate on this stuff.
Well, do you
Shelley
think like
Kagan.
oh, sorry, but do you think that if our lives were equal to that of insects, we should probably just kill ourselves?
No, I don't see why we should just kill ourselves.
I mean, because the amount of like if an insect's life and a human life is worth the same, and our mere existence causes the death of thousands of insects, then it seems like we're causing way more damage just by existing.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a straightforward utilitarian view, then sure.
Right. Where the metric is life, right? Like specifically life. Like there's other utilitarian views that wouldn't lead to suicide because they would say that humans are more sentient or this sort of thing, and they would calculate it differently. My point is that if you calculate via life, it seems to advocate human suicide due to just how much damage it would cause. But the point
Yeah.
is if you don't take that position, then you're saying a human life is worth more than an insect life. I don't know what underpins that. For most vegans that I've heard, it's some sort of like increase in sentience that that underpins that view, but I've never heard what actually how that's measured or how anyone would know that.
Yeah, I think Shelley Kagan has an interesting view called modal personism. Worth checking out on this. I'm not sure I'm 100% convinced by it, but it articulates some pretty, I think, some pretty justifiable defenses of um, treating human lives and non-human lives differently.
Okay. Well, I'm sure your my underpinning values that I've talked about this is that there's like the self-aware, the ability to conceptualize a life, and then there's the inability to do so. Whereas where I would probably draw a line. Um, but
Yeah, so
if
so I mean
you're
that's
not willing
similar
to
to
defend,
Shelley Kagan's view. That's similar. So Shelley Kagan's view is like that with some important caveats to avoid like um devaluing disabled human beings' lives and that sort of thing.
okay, yeah, okay, yeah, then that sounds very similar. But either way, when you have those sort of normative structures set up, there, I feel like there's less of a need for the push from welfarism to vegan. Um, I'm not sure. Like, so one of my arguments is that marginal cases is often used as an argument, and I don't think marginal cases holds up to scrutiny. Do you defend marginal cases as an argument?
If you're talking about, are you talking about humans?
Yeah, marginal case humans. Like, do you
Yeah.
think that the view of just valuing humans for being humans is reasonable?
Not just for being humans. The modal personism view that Kagan articulates is that, uh, just to give you a brief sampler, we value, we are justified in giving a higher um, moral status to beings who either, for whom it's true that they either are persons, will be persons, or could have been a person.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine.
Where
So
person is in the philosophical sense.
sure.
not
No, yeah,
not human. But yeah,
yeah, right. So then you would advocate against the idea of just like the idea of humans either visually or genetically, that sort of conception.
like, would I believe that it's necessarily just as wrong to, you know, enslave, kill, and eat a disabled human who has the same cognitive capacity as a cow as it would be to do it to the cow? No, I
Yeah.
think it would be a little bit worse to do it to the human.
Okay. So then I don't need to make the argument. I don't need any ideas. You already agree on it. So then I would say that appeals to marginal cases, uh, the ones that attempt to dismiss human-based values, don't pan out because human-based values are part of ethical thinking.
Hmm.
All right. Do you defend name the trait? Because I could talk about that.
I it's I hadn't heard of name the trait until recently. I'm not like super familiar with it. I
Okay.
would
Then I'm not
prefer
going to put you on
something.
the spot.
I'd prefer something like the puppies, pigs, and people
Okay.
example I gave.
Well, okay. So I think I brought up everything I want brought up. We've raised topics and we've discussed them and we both put our positions forward. And I think that's about as far as we can uh, take this argument because I don't think either one of us is going to convince you. If either of us switch positions, it's probably going to be a long. So I'll just leave it to the audience to listen to the sorts of arguments we both presented and make up their mind. And I don't know if you have any other closing you want to.
No, that's totally good with me.
Cool. Thank you for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Well, if you're all done with closing statements, I'll post the voting poll in debate chat. Thank you both for debating. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone who listened.